on this computer. Good afternoon. Imagine a bipartisan climate bill passing the U.S. Senate with over 60 votes. I can hear the virtual laughter now, but with an important shift in how we think about agriculture's role in mitigating climate change, that outcome may not be far away. My name's Jamie Powers, and I'm Senior Manager for Agricultural Engagement with Rural Investment Protect Our Environment, or RIPE. Even though we submitted the proposal for this panel before the most stressful elections of my life, we knew we wanted to think beyond. Regardless of the results, many agricultural producers across the country sense that climate legislation is headed their way. But what role should agriculture play in climate solutions? There's a lot of talk about soil organic carbon and carbon sequestration. RIPE and WAEES found that when you factor in the likely increased cost of ag inputs and the cost of adopting key practices, carbon farming payments leave most producers at a net loss. We need a payment that reflects the entire stack of the ecosystem service values from stewardship. That is the insight behind the exciting opportunity that RIPE identified. If conservation payments pay growers what they are really worth, then growers can support climate legislation that includes those payments. If growers support that legislation, then the bill can maintain Republican support from key agriculture states. And the entire agricultural supply chain benefits from stable climate policy. Transformational change is possible when the federal government transitions from just a cost share model to paying growers for what they provide through ecosystem services. Such a policy shift can shore up producer livelihoods while getting stewardship incentives right. As with other areas of sustainable agriculture, climate policy design requires innovation and collective action if we are to build a more sustainable and equitable agricultural system. RIPE's producer-led climate policy collaboration can deliver lasting impact for productivity, profitability, resilience, and environmental outcomes. When we think about agriculture's role in mitigating climate change, let's not just focus on carbon sequestration. Let's focus on the votes they can bring in Congress if producers receive compensation for the real value they are producing for society. Today, we will hear from two of the growing list of producers that are working on this policy approach, Brandon Honeycutt and Uni Beal. They are joined by Marty Matlock from the University of Arkansas and Claire Surowski, who brings a rich political and policy background to the conversation. Starting with Uni Beal, if you would please provide us with an introduction to you and your operation and share some of your thoughts on the shortcomings of the current cost share model.
Thank you very much, and thank you for asking me to speak. My husband and I, along with our son and his family, are dairy farmers in southeastern Minnesota, and we milk about 220 cows. We farm about 1,100 acres. We raise corn, soybeans, and hay, and we also raise all of our replacement young heifers and young stock. So we have always used a lot of sustainable practices over the years. We've cover crops. We've been introduced to cover crops. We rotate all our crops, have a crop rotation, and we work really closely with the soil and water, and manure management, and with the NRCS. Farmers and ranchers, they understand the importance of conserving natural resources and mitigating climate change. Their livelihoods depend on it, but their agricultural practices that build soil, water, and air quality bolster biodiversity and sequester atmospheric carbon. They often require significant time, money, and expertise. That's why programs that provide financial and technical assistance for conservation efforts, they're so vital and so popular. Currently, far more farmers are applying for contracts that are available than can support. The NRCS, or the national, is within the U.S. Department of Agriculture, offers technical assistance and financial support to keep interested farmers and help them with the climate change programs. And with a more climate resilient, NRCS will continue to judge applications under the old criteria that favors farmers that have not previously engaged in best practices over those that already have. The final rule shall be based on contract and renewal ranking on overall environmental benefits. However, the interim rule also ignores the Farm Bill's provisions on ongoing renewal opportunities because conservation is a long-term activity. And under the rule as written, contracts can only be renewed once. The natural resource conservation programs are key in reducing the burdens on farmers as they work, but the partnership between the government and farmers through these programs reflects the public good provided by working lands conservation. We need to build and expand and add to these programs.
Thanks so much, Uni. Marty Matlock, please provide us with an introduction to you and your work, as well as a short overview of how an agricultural practice can provide ecosystem services for the surrounding community.
Thank you, Jamie. It's an honor to be with this incredible group of folks. I am an executive director of the University of Arkansas Resiliency Center. I'm a professor of bio and ag engineering at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville. We've been working with the agricultural community for over 20 years around the nation and around the world to identify opportunities for improving conservation on the land, efficiency in production, and profitability from the farm, because you got to have all of those things if you're going to have a sustainable agricultural enterprise. Just want to remind folks that just in the United States, we have about 2.3 billion acres of land in the contiguous U.S. Of that, we have over 900 million acres in private farm ownership. So if we're going to achieve any sort of continent scale improvement in conservation of anything, we're going to have to engage private landowners in a way that is viable. So that's why this approach that the USDA has been implementing of compliance through voluntary engagement is so powerful, and it has been working. Let's just talk about a couple of things. Soil erosion. Soil erosion in the United States has been declining for the last 40 years dramatically from our row crop areas. We're not done yet. We still have too much erosion, and every farmer knows erosion is bad, and erosion is a cancer on the land. But reducing it is a possibility when we start engaging conservation programs and expanding our partnerships on the land. So that's important. So soil erosion, protecting the soil and the land is not just protecting this farmer's assets, it's protecting our children's assets. That's an ecosystem service that's absolutely critical. Carbon sequestration, the ability to put more carbon back in the soil using technologies that we have available today that our grandparents didn't have, is going to transform agriculture in the future. Our ability to manage nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus, to keep them on the land, they're very expensive inputs, is going to reduce nutrient loads to our rivers and streams and to the atmosphere, nitrogen in the atmosphere as a greenhouse gas, improving ecosystem services in the streams and reducing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And then we have even talked about refugia, that is, places for other life to live. Most of the wild places on the land are held by private landowners. If we do not engage private landowners in ways to encourage conservation of those places, and they love those wild things too, just as much as the rest of us, we will not have them. We need to pay our farmers for what they give us. That's a simple, simple principle. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Marty. That was great. Claire Sorowski, please provide us with an introduction to you and your work, the shortcomings of previous attempts to pass climate legislation, and how those barriers might be overcome.
Thank you, Jamie, and thank you for having me on this great panel today. My background is in environmental policy, and I worked in the Senate for a number of years on a variety of legislative efforts related to climate change and to agricultural policy. And there are a number of reasons why I think previous attempts to pass climate legislation have failed. The biggest and the first is really that climate change has become a truly divisive partisan issue, that Republican representatives and senators who understand the science and think that we need to take action are afraid to act because they think their constituents will oppose it. When I was in the Senate, Senate staffers from Republican offices couldn't even be seen with entities known to be working on climate legislation. I even worked on an effort to pass legislation focused on building resiliency and adapting to climate change as extreme weather events wreaked more and more havoc across the nation. And this should have been a fully bipartisan effort. We weren't even talking about reducing greenhouse gas emissions or the causes of climate change. But in order to work with any Republican office, we had to bend over backwards and avoid even using the term climate change at all costs. I think it's safe to say that Republican legislators have at this point become very beholden to certain industries, and they're completely ignoring the way that ag producers and others could actually benefit from fighting climate change, leaving huge opportunities on the table. While Republican youth groups and others supporting climate action have tried to change this, they have not succeeded. And the partisanship that has been created over the last 2 decades has just continued to dig in. In a country as deeply divided as ours between Republicans and Democrats, you need people from both parties to push for legislation or nothing is going to happen. So that first barrier is really the partisanship that exists. The second barrier is that we've really all been convinced that climate legislation is going to come at a big cost. And while transitioning away from fossil fuels will come at a cost in the near term for some, it can also create serious economic opportunities. And the cost of inaction most certainly will outweigh the cost of action. And then, of course, there are other issues that create disagreements like policy design, regulations versus market policies. But these issues don't really even come into play because of that partisanship that exists. So how do you overcome that barrier? And I think the most obvious thing we need to do is to change the players and reframe the approach. We need ag producers to take the reins and to make climate legislation work for them. We need legislation that is led by Middle America. We need legislation that will create real benefits worth fighting for farmers and ranchers. And there really haven't been any attempts to date to design climate legislation that puts the ag community front and center. And that's the missing piece.
Thanks so much, Claire. Brandon Honeycutt, please provide us with an introduction to you and your operation, as well as any thoughts you have on whether and how climate legislation might be an opportunity for ag producers.
Well, thank you, Jamie. And again, it's a pleasure to be here today. I'm Brandon Honeycutt. I'm from South Central Nebraska, where I farm with my brother and our semi-retired dad. We raise corn, soybeans, popcorn, a little bit in organic production as well. Our farm's fully irrigated, and we've been using different technologies over the years to help hopefully reduce some of the inputs we're using to protect the soil and the water and the air from just whatever we're utilizing. You know, I think the question is very important about whether and how climate legislation is an opportunity for ag producers. I think it's a huge opportunity. It's that next stage. You know, we see a lot of payments for farmers out there over the years through the Farm Bill and everything else. But the one thing that we really have missed is the climate change, and trying to make sure farmers are being able to be one, maybe paid for the practices they're already utilizing, whether it's cover crops, whether it's certain irrigation practices, whether it's reduced tillage, reduced nitrogen, reduced phosphorus, whatever those cases are. Maybe they can get paid, and also for those in the future, what are the changes that we can do? What are the legislation that can be passed that will incentivize that next grouping, not the early adopters, not the bleeding edgers, but the next group that's going to be coming along. I'd say, okay, I want to try something. I think it's a huge opportunity that we have in front of us. You know, as farmers, we're the ones that probably, to go off what Claire said, we need to lead this charge. And I think it's an opportunity that comes around maybe once in a generation. And I think all the stars have aligned for that key moment in time for us to really push for the legislation that will not only help farmers, but also help the climate crisis we're currently in.
That's great. Thank you so much, Brandon. I'm going to go back to Marty for this next one. Marty, what thoughts do you have on the credibility of payments that are based on ecosystem service values at the federal level?
First of all, we have to understand that our conservation programs that we've been implementing over the last 100 years are ecosystem service payments programs. We are paying farmers to conserve ecosystem services. We didn't call them that because our understanding of what ecosystems give us has evolved since we started this process in the shadows of the Dust Bowl in the 1930s. But now we understand the sophisticated interconnection of all things on the land, us included. And so we're getting better at it. In order for a market, this is what this is, to work, you need to make two parties happy, the seller and the buyer. The seller in this case are the people who own the land and farm, and the buyer in this case are the people. So we have to have a credible process by which the seller provides the service and the buyer pays for them. We have a good framework with our conservation programs, but it's not enough to get us where we need to go. It's a good start. It's built trust in this transaction, and it's built a process for moving forward. But we have to enhance the amount of payment that we provide for the incredible services that our farms provide. And the reason we got to do this even more rapidly now is because many of the private, as we see farm ownership slip from family farm ownership to corporate ownership, when I say corporate, I mean investor ownership, then the danger is that land becomes commoditized. And if land becomes commoditized rather than an asset that producers own to hand down to their children, then that intrinsic value that we have depended on for the last 200 years for our successful farming enterprise is going to shift to just simply a transactional value, which will no longer be of merit. And so we're going to have to provide the people who farm the land that they rent incentives to implement practices as well. And you can't do that with cost share. That has to be direct cost for cost payments.
With Uni, how would federal payments based on how we now understand ecosystem service values, as Marty's just described, change the game for you and for other growers?
Well, it might help. It would help tremendously if you're a producer and you're thinking of doing a process. It would help you mitigate the risk. For instance, many years ago, we were offered a grant from Soil and Water. They would pay for the seed if we put in cover crop. Well, it turned out really well, and we learned a lot of things that we could get 2 crops for cattle. But we probably wouldn't have tried it if we wouldn't have had this grant. If they would have just read something if you just read something in a magazine or something to try it, but they actually approached us, and talked us into trying it, so that it would help farmers to be more open to trying something different.
Thanks. Going over to Claire for this one. What political challenges do you see for a policy approach that is suggesting big direct payments to ag producers?
Well, I think that the first challenge, the first basic challenge is that even if there is a policy or legislative proposal that predominantly benefits ag producers and ranchers, you have to have that ag community come together and agree that it's going to fight for it. Now, the preferences of a group don't become powerful until they're organized. So that's the first challenge. And then I think the second thing would be speed. I think the more swiftly you move, the more likely you are to walk away with what you want, particularly in the Senate or the House. When you're working on legislation, when I worked on the 2013 Farm Bill, the longer an issue took to resolve and the more negotiations there were, the more wolves that there were that came to the table. So organizing effectively and moving quickly for something that will truly benefit ag producers, I think requires you to organize effectively and move quickly to make sure you get what you want out of it.
Great. Brandon, I'm going to let you finish up for us with any advice you have for farmers and ranchers that are listening to this presentation today.
My first thing is, I know if you're here, thank you for being here and being involved. And second of all, if you're a farmer, and on this listening to this panel, you're highly concerned about this. And so as farmers, my advice is we need to take the lead. We need to be the ones who are driving this conversation. It's coming. It doesn't matter. We can sit there and put our heads in the sand, but it's either coming at us or we're going to drive the train, and we're going to make sure we get the legislation we want and we need. And so we need you guys to be involved with this and helping us along the way.
Great. I just want to take a moment to thank you all for your participation today, and we look forward to the question and answer